Hello, welcome to the 7th presentation on pragmatics, and this time around we'll be looking at the topic speech act theory. As way of introducing the topic, we are saying just as people can perform physical acts such as hitting a ball, or mental acts such as imagining hitting a ball, people can also perform another kind of acts by using language. Such acts that are performed using language are what we are going to call speech acts. Some of the common speech acts are assertion. The function of assertion is to convey information. Question. That's a speech act. The function is to elicit information. Request, whose function is more or less likely eliciting action or information. Another speech act is an order, which demands action. Another speech act is promise, which commits speaker to an action. Another example of a speech act is a threat, which commits the speaker to an action that the hearer does not want. Having given that introduction, let's now look at performative speech acts. A performative speech act is a special kind of speech act which shows that we consider speech action just as legitimate as any other action. This is shown by a large number of verbs that perform purely linguistic action. Compare the sentences that we have below. There are two sets of sentences. Let's start with sentences in set 1. John has 500 kwacha. Who ate my porridge? 3. Shut up. Alright, so those are the sentences in set 1. Let's look at the sentences in set 2. The first is, I assert that John has 500 kwacha. 2. I ask, who ate my porridge? 3. I order you to shut up. Can you notice the difference or the similarity between sentences in set 1 and sentences in set 2? As the sentences illustrate, the speech acts performed in set 1 can also be performed by embedding these statements as complements of verbs that state the particular speech act. The verbs that are used to perform the acts they name are called performative verbs. Joseph has 500 kwacha. That's the first sentence in set 1. The act that is being performed in this particular sentence is assertion. So what set 2 does is to use the word assert and then say that which is being asserted. I assert that Joseph has 500 kwacha. The second in set 1 is a question. Who ate my porridge? What is happening in set 2 is a verb is used. I ask, who ate my porridge? The third statement in set 1 is an order. What does set 2 do? It actually uses the word order. So, just as we've seen, the speech acts performed in set 1 can also be performed by embedding these statements as complements of verbs that state the particular speech act. The verbs that are used to perform the acts they name are called performative verbs. The sentences in set 2 are therefore called performatives. Let's go back to the sentences. What we mean here is the verb assets, which is in the first sentence of set 2, is a performative verb. The verb ask is also a performative verb, and the verb order is also a performative verb, because these are verbs that are used to name the acts they perform. So in totality, all these sentences in set 2 are going to be called performatives. Now, there are certain conditions that are supposed to be met for a performative to be successful, and this is what we're going to look at next. Conditions for the success of performatives. They are normally contextual conditions which must be fulfilled before a speech act can be said to have been properly performed. And these conditions are usually called felicity conditions or happiness conditions. So, what are the happiness conditions for the success of performatives? Seeley, 1969, in his book Speech Acts, an Essay in the Philosophy of Language, outlines the following conditions. 1. For a performative to be successful, preparatory conditions have to be met. What are preparatory conditions? Seeley stipulates that the person performing the act must have the authority to do it, and must do it in an appropriate circumstance and with appropriate actions. For example, imagine two people in a bar, both of them drinking. A man and a woman decide to get married. And so they go to the bartender, who used to be a court clerk at some point, and ask him to marry them. The bartender concludes by saying, "I hereby pronounce you man and wife." Saying this in this context would not effect a marriage of these two people. Not only because they are drunk, but also because the bartender does not have the official social and legal status required to marry people. So it means this marriage has not been effected because preparatory conditions have not been met. Now, if you violate preparatory conditions, the act is said to be a misfire. Therefore, these two people deciding to get married in a bar and asking the bartender to marry them, this whole act is a misfire because preparatory conditions have not been met. Preparatory conditions have been violated. The second condition for the success of performative is what is called sincerity condition. For sincerity conditions to be fulfilled, the person performing the act must have appropriate beliefs and feelings. For instance, in performing an act of asserting, the speaker must really believe the proposition they are expressing. When thanking someone, one ought to really have the feeling of gratitude. When making a promise, one should sincerely intend to carry it out. If that is not done, then it means sincerity conditions have not been met. If sincerity conditions are not met, The act is actually performed, but there is said to be an abuse. So when you say thank you to a person, when in fact you don't mean to be grateful, then that is an abuse. The act has been performed, but you have abused it. It is going to be called an abuse. The third condition for the success of performatives are what are called essential conditions. Essential conditions basically define the act being carried out. Thus, for a promise, the speaker must intend his utterance to put him under an obligation to carry out the action which corresponds to its propositional content. For a request, the speaker must really intend that the utterance count as an attempt to get the hearer to do what is requested, and so on and so forth. So, essential conditions basically define the act being carried out. You must really intend to put yourself under a certain obligation as is suggested by the act that you've performed. If the essential conditions are not met, then the act has not really been carried out. Then there are what are called other conditions, apart from the three that we've already highlighted. Other conditions for the success of performatives. In the first place, the hearer should recognize the speaker's intention to perform the elocutionary act in question. Do not worry about the meaning of the word elocutionary for now, for we're going to talk about elocutionary acts at some point within this presentation. But what you need to understand here is that the hearer should recognize the speaker's intention to perform the act that is in question. And that is called uptake. Because if the hearer is not able to recognize the speaker's intention to perform an act, then there will not be uptake. Uptake, however, must be distinguished from acceptance. The fact that one refuses to accept, say, an apology does not mean that the speaker's intention has not been recognized. When somebody comes to you and says, "Please forgive me," and your reaction is, "I've understood you. I thank you for taking your time to come and ask for forgiveness, but I'm sorry. I cannot forgive you. What you did to me was too much." This particular conversation, what it means is the hearer recognized the speaker's intention. It means uptake took place. However, acceptance has failed. That's what we mean when we say uptake must be distinguished from acceptance. The fact that one refuses an apology does not mean that the speaker's intention was not recognized. Generally, uptake does not seem to be a necessary condition for speech acts. Ideally, the speaker's action subsequent to the utterance should be consistent with the purport or claim of the speech act carried out. Thus, someone who orders somebody else to do something should not be angry if they subsequently do it. After asking a question, one should give time for an answer to be given. These inappropriate actions, which are falling under other conditions, do not destroy the validity of a speech act, but they nonetheless indicate that something is amiss, and they are termed breaches of commitment. So what it means here is, if you violate the other conditions as stipulated by Seeley, it does not necessarily mean that the act has not been carried out, but what it means is there is a breach of commitment. Let's now talk about locutionally, perlocutionally, and elocutionally acts. Or locutionally, perlocutionally, and elocutionally force of an act. What does this mean? Performatives are put in a threefold distinction in order for you to know that you have performed a performative. So the first is what is called the locutionary act or the locutionary force of a speech act. Austin, 1962, explains locutionary acts as the utterance of certain noises, certain words in a certain construction, and the utterance of them with a certain sense and reference. Word Book Dictionary defines it as speech as the expression of thought. In principle, locutionary force refers to producing a certain kind of noise, then the act of composing a string of words conforming to the grammar of some language. That is the locutionary force of an utterance. Lastly, the speaker's intention forms part of the specification of the locutionary act being performed. This is because sentences may have lexical or grammatical ambiguities. The assignation of extralinguistic reference intended by the speaker also forms part of the locutionary act. Thus, to summarize what a locutionary act or a locutionary force is, one would say: produce an utterance inscription, compose a sentence, put it in a context. There you are. That is a locutionary act. So it's a combination of production of an utterance inscription, composition of a sentence, contextualizing it, and then that is the locutionary force of an utterance. The second force is what is called the perlocutionary force or the perlocutionary act. The elements which define this act are external to the locutionary act. What do we mean by this? This is the bringing about of effects on the hearer or audience as a result of uttering the statement, such effects being special to the circumstance of the utterance. Elocutionary act or elocutionary force is the third force that we're going to discuss. Acts which are internal to the locutionary act, in the sense that if the contextual conditions are appropriate, then so has the elocutionary act been performed. In other words, the elocutionary force of an utterance is the actual act that is being performed. E.g., it could be a promise, it could be a command, it could be a request, or a warning. So the actual act that is being performed by this string of words that you have composed, the actual act that is being performed is what is called the elocutionary act or the elocutionary force of that utterance. This is very important to note. Perlocutionary force and elocutionary force may not necessarily coincide. That is, not that because you intend to warn the person that the listener feels automatically warned. Remember, elocutionary force is the actual act that is being carried out. So you may mean to threaten a person, but that doesn't guarantee that the person you are threatening feels threatened. Because what you have as the person performing the act is the elocutionary force. The perlocutionary force is external to the utterance. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because you want to warn somebody, or because you want to threaten somebody, that the other person is going to feel threatened. It therefore makes sense to say, I tried to persuade her to come, but failed. Because when you say so, it means perlocutionary act has failed, while illocutionary act was successful. Now, here's a task for you. I want you to comment on whether the sentence below makes sense to you. I tried to promise to come, but I failed. I tried to promise to come, but I failed. I hope your answer is as good as mine. The sentence generally makes no sense, except in the sense that one failed to utter the words. That is, one failed to perform the locutionary act. Otherwise, apart from this reason, then the sentence cannot make any sense. How can you say you have failed to perform an illocutionary act? Because that's your intent. That's what you want to do. Perlocutionary force may fail because perlocutionary, we are talking about the effects that your utterance is going to have on the speaker. So you may intend to warn a person only to realize that the person hasn't been warned by your utterance. That is perlocutionary act failure. But we don't expect somebody to have an illocutionary act failure when he or she is actually the speaker. Now, what is the nature of illocutionary acts or illocutionary force? The bottom line is there is no communication without an illocutionary force. Now, how do speakers convey, or how do hearers understand the illocutionary force of an utterance? The first distinction is between explicit and implicit illocutionary force. Explicit illocutionary force has two types. The first one is lexical. For example, I promise you I will leave in 5 minutes. In this sentence, promise functions specifically to encode illocutionary force. So a hearer is not going to have problems to know what the illocutionary force of the utterance is, because it is clear, it is explicit by use of a word in the language. I promise you I'll leave in 5 minutes. The second type of explicit illocutionary force is grammatical. For example, try to consider what the illocutionary force is in each of the sentences below. You wrote the article. What is the illocutionary force here? Did you write the article? What is the illocutionary force in the second one? Write the article. What is the illocutionary force in the third one? In these cases, it is the grammatical form that encodes the illocutionary force. We are able to know, for example, that did you write the article is a question, even though the word ask is not part of the construction. We are able to know that the third sentence, write the article, is an order by simply looking at the grammatical arrangement of the words. And this is what we are calling grammatical explicit illocutionary force. Implicit illocutionary force. This is where the illocutionary force of an utterance is not fully specified linguistically. For instance, what speech act is encoded in the utterance below? You will leave immediately. What speech act is encoded in the utterance? what is the elocutionary force of this particular utterance. You will notice that you will leave immediately has a declarative form. That is, it encodes the force of a statement. But it could as well be used to issue a command, as in indirect speech. The last item that we're going to look at under this topic, speech acts, is classification of speech acts. It is useful to group performative verbs so as to gain a picture of the range of functions that these verbs perform. Seeley classifies performative verbs as follows. The first group of performative verbs are assertives. Assertives are performative verbs that commit the speaker to the truth of the expressed proposition. Examples include such verbs as state, claim, report, or suggest. The second class is that of directives. Directives have the intention of eliciting some sort of action on the part of the hearer. Examples of directives are such verbs as order, command, request, beg, beseech, advise to, ask to, recommend. All these are directives because they have the intention of eliciting some sort of action on the part of the hearer. The third class is that of commissives. Commissives commit the speaker to some future action. What are the examples? Verbs like promise, vow, offer, undertake, contract, threaten. All these are committing the speaker to some future action, and therefore they are called commissives. The fourth class is that of expressives. These make known the speaker's psychological attitude to a presupposed state of affairs. Examples of expressives include thank, congratulate, condole, praise, blame, forgive, pardon. All these are making known the speaker's psychological attitude to some presupposed state of affairs, and therefore they fall in the class of expressives. The last class is that of declaratives. Declaratives bring about change in reality. That is, the world is in some way no longer the same after they have been said. Declaratives encode such changes, and examples include resign, dismiss, divorce, as is used in Islam, christen, name, open, let's say an exhibition, excommunicate, sentence, let's say in court, declare. You see, usage of all these verbs in a performative implies that the world will no longer be the same in some way after they've been uttered, and that is why they are called declaratives. This is where we end the presentation on speech act theory. The next topic we're going to look at is politeness theory, and specifically we'll be looking at Brown and Levinson's theory of politeness. Thank you.